the Carney government's first budget meet expectations? And what to make of these floor crossings? How should we understand what's happening in our politics over the past 24 hours or so? As always, I'm grateful to be joined by Amanda Galbraith, founder and principal at Oyster Group, and David Coletto, founder and chair at Abacus Data. Thanks, guys, for joining me for another episode of Hub Politics.
Thanks for having us.
Good to see you both.
We've been talking for the past several weeks, guys, about the Carney government's budget, what the government needed to do to signal that it was responsive to the key issues concerning Canadians, both at a macro level and a micro level. It's fair to say that we weren't the only ones talking about it. The Prime Minister, his Finance Minister, other spokespeople for the government had set expectations pretty high that this was going to be a quote-unquote generational budget. Let me start with you, Amanda. How are you thinking about yesterday's budget and whether it meets the expectations that the government and indeed Canadians had for it?
One of the most important budgets in the Second World War, and that it will transform our economy. I do not think it meets that threshold. I mean, it may transform it in a bad way given the size of the deficit, and I think the inability to actually make really meaningful cuts to the size of government and what they're doing. But yeah, I expected a bit more. I expected a bit more urgency. I expect a bit more movement from the government. And I think what we have is, there's some good things in there. I think the changes around, the SR&ED credits is good. Getting rid of emissions cap is good. I think there's space and stuff in there around business that I think makes sense. Capital gains changes, like all those things are good. I also think, significant investment in our defense industry, good, right? But at the end of the day, we're facing a massive deficit. Servicing that is going to eclipse transfer payments to for actual health services and social services to the provinces, which is wild. And we're just supposed to trust that at some point they're going to balance this budget in the next 3 years. So I think, I would give this a B minus at best, maybe a C. I also think there's just not enough cuts to the public service. To me, it's still, I think, sprawling, unfocused, too large. There's also a couple bells and whistles in here that I have problems with. $150 million to the CBC. I know that was an election campaign promise, but why? I think we should have a functioning CBC, but that organization, just having someone interact with the media all the time, the way it functions is in no way as efficient or streamlined as any of the private sector organizations that I deal with. And then I know this is a popular thing, but why on earth are we talking about joining Eurovision? I get that we're the most European of non-European countries, but is this truly a critical issue facing Canadians? Stuff like that's going to get you in trouble. So I'm a bit befuddled as to why they positioned it in the way that they did, given it is a much more of a workman-like document than a political communications tool. Because if you have to if you're an MP and you're going out and stumping on this, what are you telling your constituent that they're taking home? Are they getting a better tax credit? No. Are they getting more service? Not really. No. So I actually think as a political communications tool, it clearly wasn't as election ready as maybe we had speculated, but I also don't think it's a transformational document in the way that the government has positioned it. So I'm a bit confused as to why they positioned it the way they did.
We'll come back to some of those points in a moment because I think they're really insightful. But let me turn to you, David. We published some analysis from you in the lead up to the budget, helping our listeners and viewers and readers understand how Canadians were feeling and what they were hoping to get from the budget. Now that we know what it sets out, how are you thinking about the Carney government's first budget?
Well, look, I think it is exactly on brand for the Carney government. I think it's about sort of a management consultant kind of way. I think if you are somebody who is deeply worried about the economic environment, not from a perspective of I will lose my job, but more of a macro view, this budget probably speaks to you because it is a significant shift away from at least the tenor and tone of the last 10 years of Trudeau governments, right? It is very much, at least in its position, whether it actually will achieve this, I'll leave it to you, Sean, as the policy expert on our panel, around growth and prosperity and trying to create an environment where we can separate ourselves from our 3-decade-long attachment to the United States' economy. So I think in that sense, if you are one of those people, most likely to be older, most likely to be in a better position, I think, yes, this budget speaks to that. Because I think, I was sitting beside my father-in-law in Edmonton yesterday while we watched all of the stuff happen. And I asked him, it was like a one-person focus group, and I said to him, like, what's your one-word reaction? He said, scary. And he said scary not because of the budget deficit or because of, what was in it, but more of like his fear that like actually Canada is at deep risk of basically fully becoming like a vassal state of the United States. And so I think that narrative and the patriotism embedded in this spoke to him and spoke to people like him. Now, to Amanda's point, if you are somebody who just barely paying the rent or can't afford food or, are deeply, deeply anxious about, your long-term economic and employment contract prospects, this budget leaves you nothing. But on the question of like, is this transformational? Here's my take, that I give this government a little more credit, because if they had come out with this even more ambitious, I think everyone would criticize them for not being able to implement it. And so in a way, I think the government has actually taken a step to say, we can only do so much. We know our government's actual capacity to implement is limited. We haven't been very good at it for the last 10 years. And I mean the public service and the ability for actually to get things done, that maybe this is as far as they thought they could go. And, my quick read of budgets passed, of new governments, including the Harper government, none of those first budgets were transformational. Even Margaret Thatcher's budget, when she was first elected, which she promised transformation, didn't happen in the first step. It's a multi-step process. And this is all happening, like Mr. Harper in 2006, with a minority. And so, look, I'm a little maybe more practical when I look at this, and I don't know if the public will be, but I do think that there's, again, two worlds out there, and half this world, one of the worlds will like what they see, I think, and the other will think this has nothing to do with me.
Yeah, the point about two worlds is well taken. That was really was reflected in the article that you wrote with us this week, David, where you said Canadians almost have these different expectations or demands from the government that are in tension. One is around precarity and safety, and the other is around trying to reset our economic position in the world. And solving for the latter risks coming at the expense, to a certain extent, of the former. And I suspect that contributed in part to what we saw play out in the budget. I want to take up something Amanda said, though, and maybe, if you'll permit me, drawing on my past experience having worked on different budgets, we used to say, this feels a bit dated, that Peter Mansbridge can only zero in on 2 or 3 signature initiatives when he comes at the top of the national on the night of the budget. And so what are those 2 or 3 defining signature items in the budget? It strikes me the government did something different this week. Instead of having 2 or 3 signature initiatives, the one, as Amanda says, that parliamentarians are going to be talking about next week when they go back to the ridings, it instead is almost a kind of theory of the case that comprises all of these different measures, none of which are necessarily hugely distinguished from the others, if that makes sense. It's an idea instead of a set of policies, an idea about the government, quote unquote, investing in the name of trying to generate more macroeconomic activity, including investment and job creation and so on. And so, Amanda, let me come to you from that point of view. 24 hours later, with the exception of defense spending, I have a hard time identifying that one big idea that that the prime minister and the government can talk about when they are defending their budget. Why don't you just weigh in on that approach, and if you think they can ultimately persuade Canadians that that a budget organized around an idea as opposed to individual measures is one that speaks to them and their needs?
I think what they've decided is this budget is not, or at least it feels like they've decided that this budget is not going to be a traditional communications tool. Like, to your point, yeah, what are the 2 or 3 kind of sticky, announceable items that people will remember, right? They attempted it a little bit with the leak the day before with the $50 billion infrastructure fund, but that is so much like I don't even think anyone's talking about that now. Mostly they're talking about floor crossing, which I know we're going to get into. But I think the choice around not doing that is an interesting one and a deliberate one. But what it'll probably mean is the vast majority of Canadians are going to see this as like a 24-hour news thing, and it's gonna disappear into the dustbin. Like last night I was listening to the 6 o'clock news in my car because I listened to it on News Talk 1010 where I peer on, and the first three stories were not the budget, federal budget.
Yes.
Even though that was like, it was not, it was a local issue. It was a skills development fund here in Ontario.
Yes.
It's because there's no big sticky item that they want to talk to. Even this morning when I was doing media on it, one of the, I was doing John Moore. He was the most listened to talk radio host and morning show in Toronto. And his comparative was like, it's like a bit of like a python eating a pig. Like if you kind of process it, but it's hard to really dig into it. And I think that's, I don't know if that's deliberate on their part or just a choice that they've made. But I think what this means is like a vehicle for them to ride over the next couple weeks and months. Like I don't see it as that. I really don't. They may choose to parse stuff out in the coming weeks and months as it gets passed. But to me, as a vehicle to say this is what our government is about, like the idea of saying, hey, we're about getting out of the way of business, like perhaps, but business isn't even that thrilled with it. So I think it's a real challenge for them to use as a vehicle to communicate.
David, what would you say to that?
Well, I mean, if you didn't know the context, the political context of this budget, you could imagine it being the first of a new majority government in its first year, right? That this would be the first step. It didn't need to land. It didn't need to boost its support. It didn't need a political halo. It just simply needed to put the markers down about what it was going to start to do over the next 4 years. In the same way that Chrétien did in 94 with his first budget, and then 95 was the big cutting budget. But the first step was stabilize things, demonstrate where we're going, and then move on. I think you could tell us, like Mr. Harper probably had a similar kind of approach in those first few budgets of his mandate. So, now it is a minority, but as we're going to talk about shortly, it may not be by the end of this week. And as a result, maybe they already knew that was going to be the case. And so they didn't worry so much about the politics. I mean, many columnists this morning is writing about like, this is not a budget built for an election. This is not a budget that was meant to do exactly as Amanda said it's not. And maybe that's purposeful. So I think we have to just keep that in mind, that this may be very much a prime minister who doesn't want to do politics and is simply looking at what the tools he has and the ability he has in the short term to try and move the ship of state to a place after 10 years of it not really, let's be honest, being focused on economic growth, trying to get it back and get that instinct and that muscle memory built up. So I don't know, but like the strategy of it, the political strategy of it makes no sense unless that's what they're thinking.
Well, I want to take up that point, which in a way you both raised, and that is that we have grown accustomed to a politics at the federal level in some of our provinces that you might characterize as principally focused on microeconomics, which is to say on the immediate needs of individuals and households, arguably at the expense of our bigger macroeconomic issues, growth, productivity, living standards, etc. And one would say that that's partly because we're living in a bit of a populist moment, and politicians are inclined to say what I'm going to do for you as opposed to what I'm going to do structurally to try to boost growth and productivity over the long term. You do get the sense that the budget deviates from that norm. That they really are making the bet that they can persuade Canadians that a combination of tax incentives and regulatory changes and public spending on public infrastructure and in other areas will generate economic activity and investment and job creation such that ultimately it will be in the interest of individuals and households. Amanda, talk about the political communications of squaring that circle. Do you think Canadians are open to that type of argument or even capable of understanding the relationship between the types of quote unquote investments the government's making and what it means for them and their families?
I sadly do not have a ton of confidence that Canadians writ large are capable of drawing a line between increased productivity means that I eventually can buy more groceries for my kids at home, right? I think that leap is a far one. And I think also to your point, we've conditioned people politically that that's not how it works and that's not how we communicate to you. And there's an expectation is, okay, what's like the goodies in the bag for me? And the alternative to that is you kind of create a movement-based coalition, which they had to a certain extent in the election campaign, right? We had an enemy that was Donald Trump, and we had Prime Minister Carney, who was the antithesis to that, and Elbows Up was around, and there were posters with Canadian pride and that kind of stuff. But that, as David has talked about, dissipates and rises. But I don't think they can rely on that to guide them going forward. So I don't think we're going to see Canadians make that leap. Where you could do that, in theory, is if you had a majority mandate and if you actually made structural changes to how we support businesses, attract investment in this country, do boost the productivity, bring the economy up. That rising tide lifts all boats. And in 2 years from now, he can say, hey, unemployment is way down. This sector has grown by X. We're building our own pipelines. Like, I think that narrative and that story would be a very compelling one for the Canadian public, but that relies on time and that relies on stability in government and your ability to candidly force, I think, a public service that is largely atrophied underneath the previous administration into being a functional partner in moving quickly and efficiently and effectively and respecting the role of the private sector. And he has a minority government, a strong minority, but it's a big gamble to do that. I actually think it's the right call, whether you're a liberal or a conservative, to do that, but it's also not a very sexy external political narrative. So it's a very tough bridge to make, but I think from a pure technocratic policy perspective, it's the Prime Minister probably doing the right thing. It just doesn't pay immediate political dividends in a way that here's your tax break or here's your new dental program does.
David?
Yeah, but let me quibble with one thing that Amanda said, and I think it's an important. We shouldn't use the term Canadians when we describe the public, because there's more than one group of them, and so some Canadians will look at this budget, as we already said, and say, "There's nothing here for me. I actually don't think this is a good step." But you have to keep in mind how powerful still the Mark Carney brand is, and what it is. It is fundamentally about a sense of security and competence and trust. In fact, delegation, that people have said, I trust this guy to lead the country through this moment. He's got experience. He knows what he's talking about. I may not understand what he's saying half the time. I may not understand 90% of what was in the budget, tax credits, accelerated, manufacture. I have no idea what any of that means, but I trust him. And so when we look at we just launched a survey this morning to gauge reaction. I've just gotten 700 or so interviews. But if you like Mark Carney, if you have a favorable view of him, 85% of them say this budget moves the country in the right direction, right? And so that's without them probably being able to even articulate much of what's in it, and also thinking the budget deficit was way too high, but implicitly thinking that whatever he's trying to do is up against this external threat that's Donald Trump, a world that has completely gone off its rocker, and I just want somebody to do it for me, and I want somebody to think about it. So in a way, you are starting to see this real deep divide in that populist instinct that had been largely almost universal for the period post-pandemic up until November 2024. And now that's splitting in half, with the other half basically being very fearful and less angry. And that, I think, is so important to understanding, in my view, the politics of the moment, and why Mark Carney will get away with this budget not being clear, not being communicatable with the audience that he's trying to engage. Largely baby boomers, largely well-off, educated Canadians who, frankly, can withstand some loss, but are deeply risk averse.
Great analysis from the two of you. We'll spend the rest of our time on less high-minded issues than accelerated capital cost allowance and some of the complex policy measures in the budget, and do a bit of rank punditry. Because as Amanda says, the biggest news out of yesterday arguably is not the 493-page budget, which, incidentally, I'd note, had the word productivity in it over 130 times. It's the fact that the government essentially stomped on its own message by announcing that a conservative member of parliament was crossing the floor to join their parliamentary caucus, essentially as the finance minister stood up in the House to deliver his budget speech. Amanda, what do you make of the timing, and how are you thinking about this announcement? What's its political significance?
I mean, it's huge. It's huge, right? They're three short of well, they were three short of a majority. They are now two short of a majority. I mean, I think the timing for the government is unfortunate because they should at least you'd want like a 24 hours of airing of your budget before basically all of us were like, hey, I could read through this 292-page document, or I can just gossip about who's going to go next. Like literally all my group chats this morning are okay. All of the Quebec caucus members showed up. Who like this person was absent, skipped caucus today. Are they coming? Like who's sworn allegiance to the leader? You know, is their Instagram locked? Like everybody's doing forensic audits of people's
Yes.
online presence and trying to check in. So you know that is where everybody's eyes are going, for better or for worse. It's fascinating. I mean, I was in opposition during I think another immensely pivotal floor crossing. I was actually sitting in the 2005 war room. I had just planned an event for then opposition leader Stephen Harper to go into PEI, and we just confirmed it all when the election was going to be called in a couple of days. And then I'm in the war room while watching this TV, and there goes Belinda Stronach across the thing to go be the new whatever ministry she was going to be, human resources development, something.
Yes.
Leaving Peter MacKay in the dust, our electoral. And I remember calling the PI, I think it was the premier's office at the time, and being like, "So we're not, yeah." They're like, "We saw the news." I'm like, "Okay, thanks so much." Like, click. So this is significant, right? And I think it maybe explains the posture of the budget to a certain extent not being so much of a election vehicle, because we've had these rumors of potential floor crossings for weeks. Like 2 weeks ago, it hit this fever pitch, and this was one of the names that was circulating. There are rumors, there are others, seemingly similar, like fairly credible rumors, I think. I know there are conversations happening in Ottawa as we record with certain individuals about whether they stay or go. But if in fact the Carney government does peel away a couple more discontented MPs, like this is a whole new ballgame for him, right? It's a 4 years. He can sit there, govern through this, make those big shifts and changes. I also think it puts Pierre Poilievre leadership at significant risk. Like I don't know if he survives a leadership in January if in fact he loses 3 MPs and they've got another 4 years in opposition, right? Like I think that's going to be tough for him, whether that's the right decision or not from the caucus. So as a person who views politics like sports and Super Bowls, this is some high stakes shit that we are dealing with right now, and it's fun. It's fun to watch from the outside because it's not my livelihood.
Yeah, David, take up anything that Amanda just said.
Well, look, I agree with everything she said. I think one thing though that I'm watching is they have to finish the job, because I do think there's risk. If I'm looking at this through the lens of just the average public, like people don't like disloyalty. People don't like the Liberal caucus cheering and this new member standing beside the prime. Like it is exactly the thing that turns people off from politics. And so while Liberals in Ottawa might be feeling like they scored a coup and maybe they're trying to, I think absolutely try to secure your majority so you can start doing the things without fear of an election. But if they don't get that done, if we are still a minority government, in the next few weeks, and this budget say passes because the NDP abstains, well then this will be one of those moments where if they are too cocky about it, it will just polarize people even more. It will push conservative voters even further into Poilievre's hands because they will once again say like, here's politics at its worst, and the Liberals are being, cocky, arrogant, and it may weaken him a little, but it may endear him as well to the partisans. So don't take this. My Liberals should be very careful that they don't cheer this as a political win as opposed to a win for the country to deliver the stability that people are looking for.
Dave, let me stay with you on that point, and then I really want to come back to Amanda on her last comments about what this could possibly mean for Poilievre's leadership. But I think a reoccurring theme in these conversations now totaling, something like five or six, thanks to both of you, by the way. I hope you've enjoyed them as much as I have had, is that one of Mark Carney's superpowers is that the people who like him don't think of him as a normal politician. that in a way he transcends partisanship and he transcends the kind of grubbiness of politics, if I can put it that way. Is there any risk here, David, for him that getting into the muck, if I can stay with that metaphor, actually pulls him down and causes people to think about him in more orthodox terms that would risk coming at the expense of that superpower?
I think there's risk. Whether people see it, whether people are paying close enough attention to notice that mucky you described, Sean, I don't know. But I think having, this new Liberal MP standing beside you at the very next day that he's crossed the floor in an event in Ottawa that he has, no personal connection to, I think is pushing the bounds. I think that was a strategic political mistake. I think they should have accepted him, have him sit down quietly in the backbenches in the House of Commons and move on and talk about what it is he's trying to do. So if people are watching and they know that this story is sort of hailing over the budget overall, yeah, it's risky because he is not seen as a typical politician, and his superpower is also that people don't think he's like Trudeau, and this does feel like a Trudeau, yes, kind of political move that is very inside baseball to people.
Now, obviously, all of this conversation has to be caveated with the fact that we are in speculation mode. I'm hearing some of the same rumors that Amanda alluded to. It's possible in the coming days we may see other Conservatives cross the floor and, in effect, give Mark Carney the majority that eluded him in April's election. Amanda, you said that it could be a major threat to Poilievre's political standing and leadership. Why don't you just elaborate on that point?
Yeah, for sure. Because right now, Poilievre's leader, and to be clear, the party is still Pierre Poilievre's, like, very much, right? Like, I think he's rebuilt this machine. There are people who go to these rallies, wait in line for hours to talk to him, like cry on his shoulder about their personal circumstance, and he stands there the whole time, listens and hears them. Like, he has built a real movement of like under 40s in particular who feel aligned with how he speaks about the world and his vision. I think you see that when he's trying to, the youth rally he did in Toronto last week. Like, there's a lot of there, but at the same time, he's also someone leading a party who is the heir presumptive to Langevin bloc, now called something else because we canceled Langevin for whatever reason, unfortunately. And people are discontent.
Apologize to any listeners and viewers who are offended.
Yes, indeed. Oh, sorry about that. I'm sure there's like 4 of them on the you probably edited all this out. But I do think that it's fraught circumstance right now, right? He's walking a bit of a tightrope because he had that promise. I think, now they're staring down a couple more years in opposition. The style of politics that he brings along, there's a lot of command and control in that team, in that center, and he's got a huge caucus to manage, and he doesn't have the bells and whistles of yes, different ministers and associate ministers to give. He gives critic roles. I think we have like the largest critic, like there's 100 something of them. It's obscene how many critics there are. So I think that is a real challenge for him to manage. And he's going into this leadership. If in fact we're now staring down another 4 years of a majority Liberal government, if that does come to pass, and that's because he's ruffled the feathers, or the feathers are ruffled of some of these MPs, I think that is really changing the equation in January for him. Not that I think we should be one and done party with our leaders, I don't, but I think that is a real challenge that he has to face. I also just want to touch quickly on what David said, which is the tone of which the Prime Minister and the Liberals have celebrated this, to me, is off-putting. And I think he just posted something on X. It was a video of him like celebrating with cheering and that kind of stuff. And we just know that, like, all the polling that I've seen too, just said that this is like the worst of politics. It's the most basic of politics. Like, you can celebrate your political achievement internally without broadcasting that out to the Canadian public. I get the need that like all the media are going to want to interview your new MP, but there's a way to air that out without sticking him directly to the Prime Minister. I think that was utterly unnecessary, and they should be more politically savvy than that.
Yeah, well said. Let's wrap up with a final big picture question. Oh, pardon me. Go ahead, David. I see you
Sean,
want to
I'm
say something.
sorry.
Please
I love this. I love our conversations because it feels like I'm in grad school again because I can offer up completely alternative theory. So just bear with me for a minute.
go.
And my theory is that this, even if he loses the majority, it might strengthen Pierre Poilievre, right? And why is that? Because he's purifying further the party that the base wants to see purified, right? Yes, I know winning is important, but like let's not underestimate just how divided the country can be right now. And so yes, I see the risk. There's high risk, but I also see an alternative that says this is Pierre Poilievre being saying like these people were never really with us and they never believed in the movement that we had. So good riddance and let's go. So how many people and we had Dick Cheney pass away this week. Like he endorsed Kamala Harris and that strengthened Donald Trump. It didn't weaken him because people would point and say Dick Cheney wasn't really one of us. And so I think we have to be, the counterfactual in this case might actually be as likely as what we assume might be the effect on Mr. Poilievre's leadership.
Let me just slide down the middle between the two of you to say one aspect. If the Carney government is able to secure a majority through these floor crossings, one way in which it will, I think, lead to disillusionment, particularly in the parliamentary caucuses. There's a lot of conservative MPs who are already feeling pretty down. They were anticipating being in the cabinet, and then of course they lost in April. One of the things that has kept them going and remain engaged and motivated by the work they're doing is that in a minority parliament, parliamentary committees can still do a lot of interesting work. They can still advance issues they care about. They can use the fact that the government doesn't have a majority of the seats on the committees to try to do the type of thing that they first aspired to do when they got themselves elected. If the Carney government ends up with a majority and they reset the parliamentary committees such that the government now controls majority on most of the committees, that one outlet that was giving a lot of MPs meaning and purpose will, for all intents and purposes, be gone. And I do worry for Poilievre that would lead to a real sense of dissatisfaction and disillusionment in the caucus, but obviously what to be seen. Final question. You guys can take this in any direction you want. Why don't I start with Amanda and end with David? 24 hours later, we're speaking at 4 o'clock on November 5th. How are you thinking about the past 24 hours and how they'll influence our politics in the coming weeks, months, and possibly years?
I think it's been chaotic, a little more chaotic than I would think, given it's Carney's first budget. I think in particular, to me, it's not so much the contents of the budget. Unfortunately, I wish we were debating economic policy right now, but I actually think what's materially going to change in the weeks and months is whether or not he gets a minority or a majority. I think sticking with a minority means we still have the government survive, but if he has a majority, to me, it's like all bets are off. We're in a whole new world. And some of the pressures that I think we're coming up against this government around being more transparent in how they communicate. Like we're not getting readouts on our negotiations with the US. Where are we with trade talks? Like all those sorts of pieces. The Prime Minister's instinct is already clearly to like he's a government of one and he doesn't have to tell us what's going on. And I think to David's point around the trust factor, that is why. But if he gets a majority government, I mean, like Godspeed. Like we're gonna just need to FOI really well and report on rumors and hopefully get sources out of the US because I think the lack of transparency and accountability that already been demonstrated in this government is troubling to me. And I think that would be like an X factor of 1,000 if they got a majority government.
David?
Look, I don't know if anything in the past 24 hours like fundamentally changes anything. I think it obviously would change if they get their majority, if more members of parliament cross over. I think that's probably the bigger story this week, not the budget, because it does signal the stability and the security of government that I think a government actually needs right now. Whether you agree with what they're doing or not, this is probably the most difficult period to have governed in the last 40 years in this country, and I think the public feels that. And so this budget I don't think it changes the trajectory of what we've seen. I think everybody kind of lines up where they were. If you felt good about Carney, you felt good about this budget. If you thought he was up to, not up to no good or not doing anything of relevance, you probably felt that about the budget too.
Guys, I know you've been in huge demand today, so I'm grateful for having you share your insights and wisdom with me. I enjoyed it a great deal. We didn't even get to Abby Lewis championing Madani's win here
Yeah.
in New York City. You mentioned the passing of Dick Cheney. We have the U.S. Supreme Court scrutinizing Trump's tariffs. It really does feel like it's been an extraordinary 24 hours in the world of politics. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to catching up next week.
Thanks, Sean. Bye,
See you
man.
next week.